Chapter 26 of Autobiography of Andrew Carnegie by Andrew Carnegie. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Tomko. Autobiography of Andrew Carnegie by Andrew Carnegie. Chapter 26. Blaine and Harrison. While one is known by the company he keeps, it is equally true that one is known by the stories he tells. Mr. Blaine was one of the best storytellers I ever met. He was a bright, sunny nature with a witty, pointed story for every occasion. Mr. Blaine's address at Yorktown (I had accompanied him there) was greatly admired. It directed special attention to the cordial friendship which had grown up between the two branches of the English-speaking race, and ended with the hope that the prevailing peace and good-will between the two nations would exist for many centuries to come. When he read this to me, I remember that the word "many" jarred, and I said, "Mr. Secretary, might I suggest a change of one word? I don't like 'many.' Why not 'all the centuries to come'?" "Good! That is perfect." And so it was given in the address, "For all the centuries to come." We had a beautiful night returning from Yorktown, and sitting in the stern of the ship in the moonlight, the military band playing forward, we spoke of the effect of music. Mr. Blaine said that his favorite just then was the Sweet By and By, which he had heard played last by the same band at President Garfield's funeral, and he thought upon that occasion he was more deeply moved by sweet sounds than he had ever been in his life. He requested that it should be the last piece played that night. Both he and Gladstone were fond of simple music. They could enjoy Beethoven and the classic masters, but Wagner was as yet a sealed book to them. In answer to my inquiry as to the most successful speech he ever heard in Congress, he replied it was that of the German, ex-Governor Ritter of Pennsylvania. The first bill appropriating money for inland fresh waters was under consideration. The House was divided. Strict constructionists held this to be unconstitutional. Only harbors upon the salt sea were under the Federal government. The contest was keen and the result doubtful, when, to the astonishment of the House, Governor Ritter slowly arose for the first time. Silence at once reigned. What was the old German ex-governor going to say, he who had never said anything at all? Only this: "Mr. Speaker, I don't know much particulars about de Constitution, but I know dis: I wouldn't gif a damned cent for a Constitution dat didn't wash in fresh water as well as in salt." The House burst into an uproar of uncontrollable laughter, and the bill passed. So came about this new departure and one of the most beneficent ways of spending government money, and of employing Army and Navy engineers. Little of the money spent by the government yields so great a return. So expands our flexible Constitution to meet the new wants of an expanding population. Let who will make the Constitution if we of today are permitted to interpret it. Mr. Blaine's best story, if one can be selected from so many that were excellent, I think was the following. In the days of slavery and the Underground Railroads, there lived on the banks of the Ohio River near Gallipolis a noted Democrat named Judge French, who said to some anti-slavery friends that he should like them to bring to his office the first runaway negro that crossed the river, bound northward by the Underground. He couldn't understand why they wished to run away. This was done, and the following conversation took place. Judge: "So you have run away from Kentucky. Bad master, I suppose?" Slave: "Oh no, Judge, very good kind massa." Judge: "He worked you too hard?" Slave: "No, saw, never overworked myself all my life." Judge (hesitatingly): "He did not give you enough to eat?" Slave: "Not enough to eat down in Kaintuck? Oh, Lor', plenty to eat." Judge: "He did not clothe you well?" Slave: "Good enough clothes for me, Judge." Judge: "You hadn't a comfortable home?" Slave: "Oh, Lor', makes me cry to think of my pretty little cabin down dar in old Kaintuck." Judge (after a pause): "You had a good, kind master. You were not overworked. Plenty to eat, good clothes, fine home. I don't see why the devil you wish to run away. Slave. Well, Judge, I left the situation down dar open. You can go right down and get it. The judge had seen a great light. Freedom has 1,000 charms to show, that slaves, howe'er contented, never know. That the colored people in such numbers risked all for liberty is the best possible proof that they will steadily approach and finally reach the full stature of citizenship in the Republic. I never saw Mr. Blaine so happy as while with us at Cluny. He was a boy again, and we were a rollicking party together. He had never fished with a fly. I took him out on Loch Laggan, and he began awkwardly, as all do, but he soon caught the swing. I shall never forget his first capture. My friend, you have taught me a new pleasure in life. There are 100 fishing lochs in Maine, and I'll spend my holidays in future upon them, trout fishing. At Cluny there is no night in June, and we danced on the lawn in the bright twilight until late. Mrs. Blaine, Miss Dodge, Mr. Blaine, and other guests were trying to do the Scotch reel, and whooping like Highlanders. We were gay revelers during those 2 weeks. One night afterwards, at a dinner in our home in New York, chiefly made up of our Cluny visitors, Mr. Blaine told the company that he had discovered at Cluny what a real holiday was. It is when the merest trifles become the most serious events of life. President Harrison's nomination for the presidency in 1888 came to Mr. Blaine while on a coaching trip with us. Mr. and Mrs. Blaine, Miss Margaret Blaine, Senator and Mrs. Hale, Miss Dodge, and Walter Damrosch were on the coach with us from London to Cluny Castle. In approaching Linlithgow from Edinburgh, we found the provost and magistrates in their gorgeous robes at the hotel to receive us. I was with them when Mr. Blaine came into the room with a cablegram in his hand, which he showed to me, asking what it meant. It read, "Use cipher." It was from Senator Elkins at the Chicago Convention. Mr. Blaine had cabled the previous day, declining to accept the nomination for the presidency unless Secretary Sherman of Ohio agreed, and Senator Elkins no doubt wished to be certain that he was in correspondence with Mr. Blaine and not with some interloper. I said to Mr. Blaine that the Senator had called to see me before sailing, and suggested we should have cipher words for the prominent candidates. I gave him a few and kept a copy upon a slip, which I put in my pocketbook. I looked and fortunately found it. Blaine was Victor, Harrison Trump, Phelps of New Jersey Star, and so on. I wired Trump and Star. This was in the evening. We retired for the night, and next day the whole party was paraded by the city authorities in their robes up the main street to the palace grounds, which were finely decorated with flags. Speeches of welcome were made and replied to. Mr. Blaine was called upon by the people and responded in a short address. Just then a cablegram was handed to him. Harrison and Morton nominated. Phelps had declined. So passed forever Mr. Blaine's chance of holding the highest of all political offices. He elected of the majority of the English-speaking race. But he was once fairly elected to the presidency and done out of New York State, as was at last clearly proven, the perpetrators having been punished for an attempted repetition of the same fraud at a subsequent election. Mr. Blaine, as Secretary of State in Harrison's cabinet, was a decided success and the Pan American Congress his most brilliant triumph. My only political appointment came at this time, and was that of a United States delegate to the Congress. It gave me a most interesting view of the South American republics and their various problems. We sat down together, representatives of all the republics but Brazil. One morning the announcement was made that a new constitution had been ratified. Brazil had become a member of the sisterhood, making 17 republics in all, now 21. There was great applause and cordial greeting of the representatives of Brazil, thus suddenly elevated. I found the South American representatives rather suspicious of their big brother's intentions. A sensitive spirit of independence was manifest, which it became our duty to recognize. In this, I think, we succeeded, but it will behoove subsequent governments to scrupulously respect the national feeling of our Southern neighbors. It is not control, but friendly cooperation upon terms of perfect equality we should seek. I sat next to Manuel Quintana, who afterwards became President of Argentina. He took a deep interest in the proceedings, and one day became rather critical upon a trifling issue, which led to an excited colloquy between him and Chairman Blaine. I believe it had its origin in a false translation from one language to another. I rose, slipped behind the chairman on the platform, whispering to him as I passed that if an adjournment was moved I was certain the differences could be adjusted. He nodded assent. I returned to my seat and moved adjournment, and during the interval all was satisfactorily arranged. Passing the delegates, as we were about to leave the hall, an incident occurred which comes back to me as I write. A delegate threw one arm around me, and with the other hand patting me on the breast, exclaimed, "Mr. Carnegie, you have more here than here," pointing to his pocket. Our Southern brethren are so lovingly demonstrative. Warm climes and warm hearts. In 1891, President Harrison went with me from Washington to Pittsburgh, as I have already stated, to open the Carnegie Hall and Library, which I had presented to Allegheny City. We traveled over the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad by daylight and enjoyed the trip, the President being especially pleased with the scenery. Reaching Pittsburgh at dark, the flaming coke ovens and dense pillars of smoke and fire amazed him. The well-known description of Pittsburgh seen from the hilltops as "hell with the lid off" seemed to him most appropriate. He was the first president who ever visited Pittsburgh. President Harrison, his grandfather, had, however, passed from steamboat to canal boat here on his way to Washington after election. The opening ceremony was largely attended owing to the presence of the President, and all passed off well. Next morning the President wished to see our steel works, and he was escorted there, receiving a cordial welcome from the workmen. I called up each successive manager of department as we passed, and presented him. Finally, when Mr. Schwab was presented, the President turned to me and said, "How is this, Mr. Carnegie? You present only boys to me." "Yes, Mr. President, but do you notice what kind of boys they are?" "Yes, hustlers, every one of them," was his comment. He was right. No such young men could have been found for such work elsewhere in this world. They had been promoted to partnership without cost or risk. If the profits did not pay for their shares, no responsibility remained upon the young men. A giving thus to partners is very different from paying wages to employees in corporations. The President's visit, not to Pittsburgh, but to Allegheny over the river, had one beneficial result. Members of the City Council of Pittsburgh reminded me that I had first offered Pittsburgh money for a library and hall, which it declined, and that then Allegheny City had asked if I would give them to her, which I did. The President visiting Allegheny to open the library and hall there, and the ignoring of Pittsburgh, was too much. Her authorities came to me again the morning after the Allegheny City opening, asking if I would renew my offer to Pittsburgh. If so, the city would accept and agree to expend upon maintenance a large percentage than I had previously asked. I was only too happy to do this, and instead of $250,000, I offered $1 million. My ideas had expanded. Thus was started the Carnegie Institute. Pittsburgh's leading citizens are spending freely upon artistic things. This center of manufacturing has had its permanent orchestra for some years, Boston and Chicago being the only other cities in America that can boast of one. A naturalist club and a school of painting have sprung up. The success of library, art gallery, museum, and music hall, a noble quartet in an immense building, is one of the chief satisfactions of my life. This is my monument, because here I lived my early life and made my start, and I am today in heart a devoted son of dear old smoky Pittsburgh. Herbert Spencer heard, while with us in Pittsburgh, some account of the rejection of my first offer of a library to Pittsburgh. When the second offer was made, he wrote me that he did not understand how I could renew it. He never could have done so. They did not deserve it. I wrote the philosopher that if I had made the first offer to Pittsburgh that I might receive her thanks and gratitude, I deserved the personal arrows shot at me and the accusations made that only my own glorification and a monument to my memory were sought. I should then probably have felt as he did. But, as it was the good of the people of Pittsburgh I had in view, among whom I had made my fortune, the unfounded suspicions of some natures only quickened my desire to work their good by planting in their midst a potent influence for higher things. This the Institute, thank the kind fates, has done. Pittsburgh has played her part nobly. End of chapter 26. Recording by William Tomko. Chapter 27 of Autobiography of Andrew Carnegie by Andrew Carnegie. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Tomko. Autobiography of Andrew Carnegie by Andrew Carnegie. Chapter 27. Washington Diplomacy. President Harrison had been a soldier and as president was a little disposed to fight. His attitude gave some of his friends concern. He was opposed to arbitrating the Bering Sea question when Lord Salisbury, at the dictation of Canada, had to repudiate the Blaine Agreement for its settlement, and was disposed to proceed to extreme measures. But calmer counsels prevailed. He was determined also to uphold the force bill against the South. When the quarrel arose with Chile, there was a time when it seemed almost impossible to keep the President from taking action which would have resulted in war. He had great personal provocation because the Chilean authorities had been most indiscreet in their statements in regard to his action. I went to Washington to see whether I could not do something toward reconciling the belligerents, because, having been a member of the first Pan-American Conference, I had become acquainted with the representatives from our southern sister republics and was on good terms with them. As luck would have it, I was just entering the Shoreham Hotel when I saw Senator Henderson of Missouri, who had been my fellow delegate to the conference. He stopped and greeted me, and, looking across the street, he said, "There's the President, beckoning to you." I crossed the street. "Hello, Carnegie. When did you arrive?" "Just arrived, Mr. President. I was entering the hotel." "What are you here for?" "To have a talk with you." "Well, come along and talk as we walk." The President took my arm, and we promenaded the streets of Washington in the dusk for more than an hour, during which time the discussion was lively. I told him that he had appointed me a delegate to the Pan American Conference, that he had assured the South American delegates when they parted that he had given a military review in their honor to show them, not that we had an army, but rather that we had none and needed none, that we were the big brother in the family of republics, and that all disputes, if any arose, would be settled by peaceful arbitration. I was therefore surprised and grieved to find that he was now apparently taking a different course, threatening to resort to war in a paltry dispute with Little Chile. "You're a New Yorker, and think nothing but business and dollars. That is the way with New Yorkers. They care nothing for the dignity and honor of the Republic," said His Excellency. "Mr. President, I am one of the men in the United States who would profit most by war. It might throw millions into my pockets as the largest manufacturer of steel." "Well, that is probably true in your case. I had forgotten." "Mr. President, if I were going to fight, I would take someone of my size." "Well, would you let any nation insult and dishonor you because of its size?" "Mr. President, no man can dishonor me except myself. Honor wounds must be self-inflicted." "You see our sailors were attacked on shore and 2 of them killed, and you would stand that?" he asked. "Mr. President, I do not think the United States dishonored every time a row among drunken sailors takes place. Besides, these were not American sailors at all. They were foreigners, as you see by their names. I would be disposed to cashier the captain of that ship for allowing the sailors to go on shore when there was rioting in the town and the public peace had been already disturbed." The discussion continued until we had finally reached the door of the White House in the dark. The President told me he had an engagement to dine out that night, but invited me to dine with him the next evening, when, as he said, there would be only the family and we could talk. "I am greatly honored, and shall be with you tomorrow evening," I said. And so we parted. The next morning I went over to see Mr. Blaine, then Secretary of State. He rose from his seat and held out both hands. "Oh, why weren't you dining with us last night? When the President told Mrs. Blaine that you were in town, she said, 'Just think, Mr. Carnegie is in town and I had a vacant seat here he could have occupied.'" "Well, Mr. Blaine, I think it is rather fortunate that I have not seen you," I replied, and I then told him what had occurred with the President. "Yes," he said, "it really was fortunate. The President might have thought you and I were in collusion." Senator Elkins of West Virginia, a bosom friend of Mr. Blaine and also a very good friend of the President, happened to come in, and he said he had seen the President, who told him that he had had a talk with me upon the Chilean affair last evening, and that I had come down hot upon the subject. "Well, Mr. President," said Senator Elkins, "it is not probable that Mr. Carnegie would speak as plainly to you as he would to me. He feels very keenly, but he would naturally be somewhat reserved in talking to you." The President replied, "I didn't see the slightest indication of reserve, I assure you." The matter was adjusted, thanks to the peace policy characteristic of Mr. Blaine. More than once he kept the United States out of foreign trouble, as I personally knew. The reputation that he had of being an aggressive American really enabled that great man to make concessions which, made by another, might not have been readily accepted by the people. I had a long and friendly talk with the President that evening at dinner, but he was not looking at all well. I ventured to say to him he needed a rest. By all means he should get away. He said he had intended going off on a revenue cutter for a few days, but Judge Bradley of the Supreme Court had died and he must find a worthy successor. I said there was one I could not recommend because we had fished together and were such intimate friends that we could not judge each other disinterestedly, but he might inquire about him. Mr. Shiraz, of Pittsburgh. He did so and appointed him. Mr. Shiraz received the strong support of the best elements everywhere. Neither my recommendation nor that of anyone else would have weighed with President Harrison one particle in making the appointment if he had not found Mr. Shiraz the very man he wanted. In the Bering Sea dispute the President was incensed at Lord Salisbury's repudiation of the stipulations for settling the question which had been agreed to. The President had determined to reject the counter proposition to submit it to arbitration. Mr. Blaine was with the President in this, and naturally indignant that his plan, which Salisbury had extolled through his ambassador, had been discarded. I found both of them in no compromising mood. The President was much the more excited of the two, however. Talking it over with Mr. Blaine alone, I explained to him that Salisbury was powerless. Against Canada's protest he could not force acceptance of the stipulations to which he had hastily agreed. There was another element. He had a dispute with Newfoundland on hand, which the latter was insisting must be settled to her advantage. No government in Britain could add Canadian dissatisfaction to that of Newfoundland. Salisbury had done the best he could. After a while Blaine was convinced of this and succeeded in bringing the President into line. The Bering Sea troubles brought about some rather amusing situations. One day Sir John Macdonald, Canadian Premier, and his party reached Washington and asked Mr. Blaine to arrange an interview with the President upon this subject. Mr. Blaine replied that he would see the President and inform Sir John the next morning. "Of course," said Mr. Blaine, telling me the story in Washington just after the incident occurred, "I knew very well that the President could not meet Sir John and his friends officially, and when they called I told them so. Sir John said that Canada was independent, as sovereign as the State of New York was in the Union." Mr. Blaine replied he was afraid that if he ever obtained an interview as Premier of Canada with the State authorities of New York, he would soon hear something on the subject from Washington, and so would the New York State authorities. It was because the President and Mr. Blaine were convinced that the British government at home could not fulfill the stipulations agreed upon that they accepted Salisbury's proposal for arbitration, believing he had done his best. That was a very sore disappointment to Mr. Blaine. He had suggested that Britain and America should each place 2 small vessels on Bering Sea with equal rights to board or arrest fishing vessels under either flag, in fact, a joint police force. To give Salisbury due credit, he cabled the British ambassador, Sir Julian Pauncefote, to congratulate Mr. Blaine upon his brilliant suggestion. It would have given equal rights to each, and under either or both flags for the first time in history. A just and brotherly compact. Sir Julian had shown this cable to Mr. Blaine. I mention this here to suggest that able and willing statesmen anxious to cooperate are sometimes unable to do so. Mr. Blaine was indeed a great statesman, a man of wide views, sound judgment, and always for peace. Upon war with Chile, upon the Force Bill, and the Bering Sea question, he was calm, wise, and peace-pursuing. Especially was he favorable to drawing closer and closer to our own English-speaking race. For France he had gratitude unbounded for the part she had played in our Revolutionary War, but this did not cause him to lose his head. One night at dinner in London, Mr. Blaine was at close quarters for a moment. The Clayton-Bulwer Treaty came up. A leading statesman present said that the impression they had was that Mr. Blaine had always been inimical to the mother country. Mr. Blaine disclaimed this, and justly so, as far as I knew his sentiments. His correspondence upon the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty was instanced. Mr. Blaine replied, "When I became Secretary of State and had to take up that subject, I was surprised to find that your Secretary for Foreign Affairs was always informing us what Her Majesty expected, while our Secretary of State was telling you what our President ventured to hope. When I received a dispatch telling us what Her Majesty expected, I replied, telling you what our President expected." "Well, you admit you'd changed the character of the correspondence," was shot at him. Quick as a flash came the response, "Not more than conditions had changed. The United States had passed the stage of venturing to hope with any power that expects. I only followed your example, and should ever Her Majesty venture to hope, the President will always be found doing the same. I am afraid that as long as you expect, the United States will also expect in return." One night there was a dinner where Mr. Joseph Chamberlain and Sir Charles Tennant, president of the Scotland Steel Company, were guests. During the evening the former said that his friend Carnegie was a good fellow, and they all delighted to see him succeeding. But he didn't know why the United States should give him protection worth £1 million sterling per year or more for condescending to manufacture steel rails. "Well," said Mr. Blaine, "we don't look at it in that light. I am interested in railroads, and we formerly used to pay you for steel rails $90 per ton for every ton we got, nothing less. Now, just before I sailed from home, our people made a large contract with our friend Carnegie at $30 per ton. I am somewhat under the impression that if Carnegie and others had not risked their capital in developing their manufacture on our side of the Atlantic, we would still be paying you $90 per ton today." Here Mr. Charles broke in. "You may be sure you would. $90 was our agreed-upon price for you foreigners." Mr. Blaine smilingly remarked, "Mr. Chamberlain, I don't think you have made a very good case against our friend Carnegie." "No," he replied. "How could I, with Sir Charles giving me away like that?" And there was general laughter. Blaine was a rare raconteur, and his talk had this great merit. Never did I hear him tell a story or speak a word unsuitable for any, even the most fastidious company to hear. He was as quick as a steel trap, a delightful companion, and he would have made an excellent and yet safe president. I found him truly conservative and strong for peace upon all international questions. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Autobiography of Andrew Carnegie by Andrew Carnegie. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Tomko. Autobiography of Andrew Carnegie by Andrew Carnegie. Chapter 28. Hay and McKinley. John Hay was our frequent guest in England and Scotland, and was on the eve of coming to us at Skibo in 1898 when called home by President McKinley to become Secretary of State. Few have made such a record in that office. He inspired men with absolute confidence in his sincerity, and his aspirations were always high. War he detested, and meant what he said when he pronounced it the most ferocious and yet the most futile folly of man. The Philippines annexation was a burning question when I met him and Henry White, Secretary of Legation and later Ambassador to France, in London, on my way to New York. It gratified me to find our views were similar upon that proposed serious departure from our traditional policy of avoiding distant and disconnected possessions and keeping our empire within the continent, especially keeping it out of the vortex of militarism. Hay, White, and I clasped hands together in Hay's office in London and agreed upon this. Before that he had written me the following note: London, August 22, 1898. My dear Carnegie, I thank you for the Skibo grouse and also for your kind letter. It is a solemn and absorbing thing to hear so many kind and unmerited words as I have heard and read this last week. It seems to me another man they are talking about, while I am expected to do the work. I wish a little of the kindness could be saved till I leave office finally. I have read with keenest interest your article in the North American. I am not allowed to say in my present fix how much I agree with you. The only question on my mind is how far it is now possible for us to withdraw from the Philippines. I am rather thankful it is not given to me to solve that momentous question. It was a strange fate that placed upon him the very task he had congratulated himself was never to be his. He stood alone at first as friendly to China in the Boxer troubles and succeeded in securing for her fair terms of peace. His regard for Britain, as part of our own race, was deep, and here the President was thoroughly with him, and grateful beyond measure to Britain for standing against other European powers disposed to favor Spain in the Cuban War. The Hay-Pauncefote Treaty concerning the Panama Canal seemed to many of us unsatisfactory. Senator Elkins told me my objections, given in the New York Tribune, reached him the day he was to speak upon it, and were useful. Visiting Washington soon after the article appeared, I went with Senator Hanna to the White House early in the morning and found the President much exercised over the Senate's amendment to the treaty. I had no doubt of Britain's prompt acquiescence in the Senate's requirements, and said so. Anything in reason she would give, since it was we who had to furnish the funds for the work from which she would be, next to ourselves, the greatest gainer. Senator Hanna asked if I had seen John, as he and President McKinley always called Mr. Hay. I said I had not. Then he asked me to go over and cheer him up, for he was disconsolate about the amendments. I did so. I pointed out to Mr. Hay that the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty had been amended by the Senate, and scarcely anyone knew this now, and no one cared. The Hay-Pauncefote Treaty would be executed as amended, and no one would care a fig whether it was in its original form or not. He doubted this, and thought Britain would be indisposed to recede. A short time after this, dining with him, he said I had proved a true prophet, and all was well. Of course it was. Britain had practically told us she wished the canal built, and would act in any way desired. The canal is now as it should be, that is, all American, with no international complications possible. It was, perhaps, not worth building at that time, but it was better to spend 300 or 400 millions upon it than in building sea monsters of destruction to fight imaginary foes. One may be a loss, and there an end. The other might be a source of war, for oft the sight of means to do ill deeds make deeds ill done. Mr. Hay's bête noire was the Senate. Upon this, and this only, was he disregardful of the proprieties. When it presumed to alter one word, substituting treaty for agreement, which occurred in one place only in the proposed arbitration treaty of 1905, he became unduly excited. I believe this was owing in great degree to poor health, for it was clear by that time to intimate friends that his health was seriously impaired. The last time I saw him was at lunch at his house, when the arbitration treaty, as amended by the Senate, was under the consideration of President Roosevelt. The arbitrationists, headed by the ex-Secretary of State Foster, urged the President's acceptance of the amended treaty. We thought he was favorable to this, but from my subsequent talk with Secretary Hay, I saw that the President's agreeing would be keenly felt. I should not be surprised if Roosevelt's rejection of the treaty was resolved upon chiefly to soothe his dear friend John Hay in his illness. I am sure I felt that I could be brought to do, only with the greatest difficulty, anything that would annoy that noble soul. But upon this point Hay was obdurate. No surrender to the Senate. Leaving his house, I said to Mrs. Carnegie that I doubted if ever we should meet our friend again. We never did. The Carnegie Institution of Washington, of which Hay was the chairman and a trustee from the start, received his endorsement and close attention, and much were we indebted to him for wise counsel. As a statesman, he made his reputation in shorter time and with a surer touch than any other I know of, and it may be doubted if any public man ever had more deeply attached friends. One of his notes I have long kept. It would have been the most flattering of any to my literary vanity, but for my knowledge of his most lovable nature and undue warmth for his friends. The world is poor to me today as I write, since he has left it. The Spanish War was the result of a wave of passion started by the reports of the horrors of the Cuban Revolution. President McKinley tried hard to avoid it. When the Spanish minister left Washington, the French ambassador became Spain's agent, and peaceful negotiations were continued. Spain offered autonomy for Cuba. The president replied that he did not know exactly what autonomy meant. What he wished for Cuba was the rights that Canada possessed. He understood these. A cable was shown to the president by the French minister, stating that Spain granted this, and he, dear man, supposed all was settled. So it was, apparently. Speaker Reed usually came to see me Sunday mornings when in New York, and it was immediately after my return from Europe that year that he called and said he had never lost control of the House before. For one moment he thought of leaving the chair and going on the floor to address the House and try to quiet it. In vain it was explained that the President had received from Spain the guarantee of self-government for Cuba. Alas, it was too late. Too late. "What is Spain doing over here, anyhow?" was the imperious inquiry of Congress. A sufficient number of Republicans had agreed to vote with the Democrats in Congress for war. A whirlwind of passion swept over the House, intensified, no doubt, by the unfortunate explosion of the warship Maine in Havana Harbor, supposed by some to be Spanish work. The supposition gave Spain far too much credit for skill and activity. War was declared, the Senate being shocked by Senator Proctor's statement of the concentration camps he had seen in Cuba. The country responded to the cry. "What is Spain doing over here, anyhow?" President McKinley and his peace policy were left high and dry, and nothing remained for him but to go with the country. The government then announced that war was not undertaken for territorial aggrandizement, and Cuba was promised independence, a promise faithfully kept. We should not fail to remember this, for it is the one cheering feature of the war. The possession of the Philippines left a stain. They were not only territorial acquisition, they were dragged from reluctant Spain, and $20 million paid for them. The Filipinos had been our allies in fighting Spain. The cabinet, under the lead of the president, had agreed that only a coaling station in the Philippines should be asked for, and it is said such were the instructions given by cable at first to the peace commissioners at Paris. President McKinley then made a tour through the West, and, of course, was cheered when he spoke of the flag and Dewey's victory. He returned impressed with the idea that withdrawal would be unpopular, and reversed his former policy. I was told by one of his cabinet that every member was opposed to the reversal. A senator told me Judge Day, one of the peace commissioners, wrote a remonstrance from Paris, which, if ever published, would rank next to Washington's farewell address. So fine was it. At this stage an important member of the cabinet, my friend Cornelius N. Bliss, called and asked me to visit Washington and see the President on the subject. He said, "You have influence with him. None of us have been able to move him since he returned from the West." I went to Washington and had an interview with him. But he was obdurate. Withdrawal would create a revolution at home, he said. Finally, by persuading his secretaries that he had to bend to the blast, and always holding that it would be only a temporary occupation and that a way out would be found, the cabinet yielded. He sent for President Sherman, of Cornell University, who had opposed annexation, and made him chairman of the committee, to visit the Filipinos, and later for Judge Taft, who had been prominent against such a violation of American policy, to go as governor. When the judge stated that it seemed strange to send for one who had publicly denounced annexation, the President said that was the very reason why he wished him for the place. This was all very well, but to refrain from annexing and to relinquish territory once purchased are different propositions. This was soon seen. Mr. Bryan had it in his power at one time to defeat in the Senate this feature of the treaty of peace with Spain. I went to Washington to try to effect this, and remained there until the vote was taken. I was told that when Mr. Bryan was in Washington he had advised his friends that it would be good party policy to allow the treaty to pass. This would discredit the Republican Party before the people. That paying $20 millions for a revolution would defeat any party. There were 7 staunch Bryan men anxious to vote against Philippine annexation. Mr. Bryan had called to see me in New York upon the subject, because my opposition to the purchase had been so pronounced, and I now wired him at Omaha explaining the situation and begging him to wire me that his friends would use their own judgment. His reply was what I have stated: better have the Republicans pass it and let it then go before the people. I thought it unworthy of him to subordinate such an issue, fraught with deplorable consequences, to mere party politics. It required the casting vote of the Speaker to carry the measure. One word from Mr. Bryan would have saved the country from the disaster. I could not be cordial to him for years afterwards. He had seemed to me a man who was willing to sacrifice his country and his personal convictions for party advantage. When I called upon President McKinley immediately after the vote, I condoled with him upon being dependent for support upon his leading opponent. I explained just how his victory had been won, and suggested that he should send his grateful acknowledgments to Mr. Bryan. A colonial possession thousands of miles away was a novel problem to President McKinley, and indeed to all American statesmen. Nothing did they know of the troubles and dangers it would involve. Here the Republic made its first grievous international mistake, a mistake which dragged it into the vortex of international militarism and a great navy. What a change has come over statesmen since! At supper with President Roosevelt at the White House a few weeks ago, 1907, he said, "If you wish to see the 2 men in the United States who are the most anxious to get out of the Philippines, here they are," pointing to Secretary Taft and himself. "Then why don't you?" I responded. "The American people would be glad indeed." But both the President and Judge Taft believed our duty required us to prepare the islands for self-government first. This is the policy of don't go into the water until you learn to swim. But the plunge has to be and will be taken some day. It was urged that if we did not occupy the Philippines, Germany would. It never occurred to the urgers that this would mean Britain agreeing that Germany should establish a naval base at Macao. A short sail from Britain's naval base in the East Britain would as soon permit her to establish a base at Kingston, Ireland, 80 miles from Liverpool. I was surprised to hear men like Judge Taft, although he was opposed at first to the annexation, give this reason when we were discussing the question after the fatal step had been taken. But we know little of foreign relations. We have hitherto been a consolidated country. It will be a sad day if we ever become anything otherwise. End of Chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Autobiography of Andrew Carnegie by Andrew Carnegie. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Tomko. Autobiography of Andrew Carnegie by Andrew Carnegie, Chapter 29, Meeting the German Emperor. My first rectorial address to the students of St. Andrew's University attracted the attention of the German Emperor, who sent word to me in New York by Herr Ballin that he had read every word of it. He also sent me by him a copy of his address upon his eldest son's consecration. Invitations to meet him followed, but it was not until June 1907 that I could leave, owing to other engagements. Mrs. Carnegie and I went to Kiel. Mr. Tower, our American ambassador to Germany, and Mrs. Tower met us there and were very kind in their attentions. Through them we met many of the distinguished public men during our 3 days' stay there. The first morning Mr. Tower took me to register on the Emperor's yacht. I had no expectation of seeing the Emperor, but he happened to come on deck, and seeing Mr. Tower, he asked what had brought him on the yacht so early. Mr. Tower explained that he had brought me over to register, and that Mr. Carnegie was on board. He asked, "Why not present him now? I wish to see him." I was talking to the admirals who were assembling for a conference, and did not see Mr. Tower and the Emperor approaching from behind. A touch on my shoulder, and I turned around. Mr. Carnegie, the Emperor. It was a moment before I realized that the Emperor was before me. I raised both hands and exclaimed, "This has happened just as I could have wished, with no ceremony," and the man of destiny dropped from the clouds. Then I continued, "Your Majesty, I have traveled 2 nights to accept your generous invitation, and never did so before to meet a crowned head." Then the Emperor, smiling, and such a captivating smile, "Oh, yes, yes, I have read your books. You do not like kings." "No, your Majesty, I do not like kings, but I do like a man behind a king when I find him." "Ah, there is one king you like, I know, a Scottish king, Robert the Bruce. He was my hero in my youth. I was brought up on him." "Yes, your Majesty, so was I, and he lies buried in Dunfermline Abbey in my native town. When a boy, I used to walk often around the towering square monument on the Abbey, one word on each block in big stone letters, King Robert the Bruce, with all the fervor of a Catholic counting his heads. But Bruce was much more than a king, your Majesty. He was the leader of his people. And not the first. Wallace the man of the people comes first. Your Majesty, I now own King Malcolm's Tower in Dunfermline, he from whom you derive your precious heritage of Scottish blood. Perhaps you know the fine old ballad, Sir Patrick Spens. The king sits in Dunfermline Tower, drinking the bluid red wine. I should like to escort you some day to the tower of your Scottish ancestor, that you may do homage to his memory." He exclaimed, "That would be very fine. The Scotch are much quicker and cleverer than the Germans. The Germans are too slow. Your Majesty, where anything Scotch is concerned, I must decline to accept you as an impartial judge." He laughed and waved adieu, calling out, "You are to dine with me this evening," and excusing himself went to greet the arriving admirals. About 60 were present at the dinner, and we had a pleasant time. Indeed, His Majesty, opposite whom I sat, was good enough to raise his glass and invite me to drink with him. After he had done so with Mr. Tower, our ambassador, who sat at his right, he asked across the table, heard by those near, whether I had told Prince von Bülow, next whom I sat, that his, the Emperor's, hero, Bruce, rested in my native town of Dunfermline, and his ancestor's tower in Pittencrieff Glen was in my possession. "No," I replied, "with your Majesty I am led into such frivolities, but my intercourse with your Lord High Chancellor, I assure you, will always be of a serious import." We dined with Mrs. Goelet upon her yacht one evening, and His Majesty being present, I told him President Roosevelt had said recently to me that he wished custom permitted him to leave the country so he could run over and see him, the Emperor. He thought a substantial talk would result in something good being accomplished. I believed that also. The Emperor agreed and said he wished greatly to see him and hoped he would some day come to Germany. I suggested that he, the Emperor, was free from constitutional barriers and could sail over and see the President. "Ah, but my country needs me here. How can I leave?" I replied, before leaving home one year, when I went to our mills to bid the officials good bye, and expressed regret at leaving them all hard at work, sweltering in the hot sun, but that I found I had now every year to rest, and yet no matter how tired I might be, 1/2 hour on the bow of the steamer, cutting the Atlantic waves, gave me perfect relief. My clever manager, Captain Jones, retorted, "And, oh Lord, think of the relief we all get." "It might be the same with your people, Your Majesty." He laughed heartily over and over again. It opened a new train of thought. He repeated his desire to meet President Roosevelt, and I said, "Well, Your Majesty, when you two do get together, I think I shall have to be with you. You and he, I fear, might get into mischief." He laughed and said, "Oh, I see. You wish to drive us together. Well, I agree. If you make Roosevelt first horse, I shall follow." "Ah, no, Your Majesty. I know horseflesh better than to attempt to drive two such gay colts tandem. You never get proper purchase on the first horse. I must yoke you both in the shafts, neck and neck, so I can hold you in." I never met a man who enjoyed stories more keenly than the Emperor. He is fine company, and I believe an earnest man, anxious for the peace and progress of the world. Suffice it to say, he insists that he is, and always has been, for peace. 1907. He cherishes the fact that he has reigned for 24 years and has never shed human blood. He considers that the German navy is too small to affect the British and was never intended to be a rival. Nevertheless, it is in my opinion very unwise, because unnecessary, to enlarge it. Prince von Bülow holds these sentiments, and I believe the peace of the world has little to fear from Germany. Her interests are all favorable to peace, industrial development being her aim, and in this desirable field she is certainly making great strides. I sent the Emperor, by his ambassador, Baron von Sternberg, the book, The Roosevelt Policy, to which I had written an introduction that pleased the President, and I rejoice in having received from him a fine bronze of himself with a valued letter. He is not only an emperor, but something much higher, a man anxious to improve existing conditions, untiring in his efforts to promote temperance, prevent dueling, and, I believe, to secure international peace. I have for some time been haunted with the feeling that the Emperor was indeed a man of destiny. My interviews with him have strengthened that feeling. I have great hopes of him in the future doing something really great and good. He may yet have a part to play that will give him a place among the immortals. He has ruled Germany in peace for 27 years, but something beyond even this record is due from one who has the power to establish peace among civilized nations through positive action. Maintaining peace in his own land is not sufficient from one whose invitation to other leading civilized nations to combine and establish arbitration of all international disputes would be gladly responded to. Whether he is to pass into history as only the preserver of internal peace at home, or is to rise to his appointed mission as the apostle of peace among leading civilized nations, the future has still to reveal. The year before last, 1912, I stood before him in the Grand Palace in Berlin and presented the American address of congratulations upon his peaceful reign of 25 years, his hand unstained by human blood. As I approached to hand to him the casket containing the address, he recognized me and with outstretched arms exclaimed, "Carnegie, 25 years of peace, and we hope for many more." I could not help responding, "And in this noblest of all missions you are our chief ally." He had hitherto sat silent and motionless, taking the successive addresses from one officer and handing them to another to be placed upon the table. The chief subject under discussion had been world peace, which he could have, and in my opinion would have secured, had he not been surrounded by the military caste which inevitably gathers about one born to the throne. A caste which usually becomes as permanent as the potentate himself, and which has so far in Germany proved its power of control whenever the war issue has been presented. Until militarism is subordinated, there can be no world peace. As I read this today, 1914, what a change! The world convulsed by war as never before. Men slaying each other like wild beasts. I dare not relinquish all hope. In recent days I see another ruler coming forward upon the world stage, who may prove himself the immortal one. The man who vindicated his country's honor in the Panama Canal toll dispute is now president. He has the indomitable will of genius, and true hope which we are told, "Kings it makes gods, and meaner creatures kings." Nothing is impossible to genius. Watch President Wilson. He has Scotch blood in his veins. Here the manuscript ends abruptly. End of chapter 29. End of Autobiography of Andrew Carnegie by Andrew Carnegie.